In this episode, we're going to make the cloud account model feel simple and solid, because so many security mistakes start with a fuzzy understanding of where boundaries actually are. Beginners often picture the cloud as one big place where resources float around, but cloud providers organize everything into containers that determine who can do what, where things live, and who pays for them. Those containers also determine how far an attacker can move if they get in, which is why defenders care about them so much. When you hear terms like tenant, subscription, project, and billing boundary, you should not hear paperwork. You should hear structure, authority, and blast radius. By the end, you should be able to explain these account fundamentals in plain language, predict how a change at one layer affects the layers below, and understand why good structure is a security control even before you add any other control. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is with the idea that cloud providers need a top-level container to represent an organization, because otherwise there is no clean way to separate one customer from another. That top-level container is often described as a tenant, and even though different platforms use different words, the concept is consistent. A tenant is where an organization's primary identity space lives, meaning it is the root place where users, groups, and trust relationships are managed. This is the point where ownership and authority begin, not just for resources, but for who is allowed to create and manage resources. When something is configured at the tenant level, it often affects everything that sits underneath it, which makes it powerful and therefore sensitive. Beginners sometimes think tenant is just a label you see on invoices, but it is more like the foundation of a building, because everything else depends on it being stable and protected. Once you accept the tenant as the top-level identity and administrative boundary, the next concept is the idea of carving the tenant into smaller containers that hold resources. Cloud providers do this because organizations need separation between teams, environments, and workloads, and they also need a way to track costs and limits. These smaller containers are often called subscriptions or projects, and while the terminology varies, the practical role is similar. They give you a place where compute, storage, network components, and managed services can be created and organized in a controlled scope. They also give you a place where permissions can be assigned so that one team can manage its own area without automatically controlling everything in the tenant. This is where beginners often make their first wrong assumption, which is believing that a subscription or project is the same thing as a tenant. It is not, because identity often lives above it, and that distinction matters. To make these layers feel real, it helps to separate two ideas that are often blended together in beginner thinking: identity scope and resource scope. Identity scope is where users and roles are defined and where authentication decisions are anchored, while resource scope is where actual cloud services and assets are created and managed. Tenants usually define identity scope, while subscriptions or projects usually define resource scope. The reason this matters is that an identity created in the tenant can often be granted access to multiple subscriptions or projects, which means tenant-level identity decisions can pierce what looks like resource isolation. Beginners sometimes treat a project boundary like a wall, when it may be more like a fence that can be opened by permissions granted above it. When you design security, you have to understand where the wall truly is and where it is only a wall if you keep permissions disciplined. This is why account fundamentals are not just vocabulary. They're the map of where control actually flows. Billing boundaries are part of this map too. Even though billing sounds like a finance-only concern at first, cloud providers need a way to attach usage costs to something, and subscriptions or projects often serve as billing containers that collect charges for resources inside them. From a security perspective, billing boundaries influence governance because cost ownership often aligns with decision ownership. When a team is responsible for a subscriptions bill, that team tends to care more about what gets created there, who can create it, and how long it stays around. That accountability can support cleaner access control and better hygiene, which are security benefits even if the motivation started as cost control. The opposite is also true. because when billing is muddled and everyone shares one big container, responsibility becomes blurred and security oversight becomes harder. Attackers do not care who pays, but defenders care because billing structure shapes behavior, and behavior shapes security outcomes. Account boundaries also shape risk through a concept that comes up again and again in cloud defense: blast radius. Blast radius is a simple way of describing how far damage can spread when something goes wrong, whether it is an attacker, a misconfiguration, or a careless change. If everything is in one subscription or one project, then a compromised identity with broad permissions can potentially affect everything at once. If environments are separated, then compromise might be contained to a smaller area, which buys defenders time and reduces impact. Beginners sometimes assume that separating resources is unnecessary overhead, but in the cloud, separation is one of the most powerful ways to limit damage because access control is central and changes can happen quickly. A well-chosen boundary is like a fire door in a building. It does not prevent every fire, but it prevents a small fire from becoming a whole building event. When you understand blast radius, account structure stops feeling abstract and starts feeling protective. This naturally leads to the question of how many subscriptions or projects an organization should have, and the right answer is never a single magic number. The security lesson is that you want enough separation to make compromise less catastrophic, but not so much fragmentation that governance becomes unmanageable. If you create too many containers without clear purpose, you may lose visibility, skip reviews, and leave forgotten environments running. If you create too few, you may create large shared spaces where permissions must be broad to keep work moving, which increases risk. Beginners often think the choice is between simple and secure, but the mature view is that simplicity and security can support each other when structure is intentional. The key is to define why a boundary exists, such as separating production from development, isolating sensitive data workloads, or separating business units with different risk profiles. When boundaries reflect real differences in risk and ownership, they become easier to manage and more effective. Identity is the thread that ties these boundaries together, and cloud account fundamentals are incomplete without understanding how permissions are granted across layers. Identity and access management, IAM, is the broad term for the systems and policies that decide who can do what, and it operates within the tenant and down into subscriptions or projects. A common beginner misunderstanding is assuming that if you are an administrator somewhere, you are automatically an administrator everywhere. In reality, permissions are usually scoped, but scoping only works when roles are assigned thoughtfully and when high-privilege roles are limited and monitored. If a person is granted a tenant-wide administrative role for convenience, then the separation created by subscriptions or projects may become meaningless because that role can reach across them. This is why defenders focus so heavily on keeping the most powerful roles rare and well-governed. The account model gives you the possibility of separation, but IAM decides whether you actually get it. A related concept that often confuses beginners is inheritance, which is the idea that some settings and permissions can flow from higher levels down to lower levels. In many cloud setups, policies applied at a higher organizational level can affect every subscription or project underneath, which can be helpful when you want consistency. The risk is that inheritance can also spread mistakes, such as an overly broad permission or a weak policy that becomes a default everywhere. This is why defenders care about where policies are applied, not just what the policies say. Applying a strong guardrail high in the hierarchy can prevent a dangerous configuration across the entire environment, which is great, but applying a careless permission high in the hierarchy can create systemic risk. Beginners often focus on individual resources and forget the hierarchy, but attackers love hierarchical mistakes because they scale. Understanding inheritance makes you more cautious in a healthy way because you begin to see how a single decision can echo across the environment. Account fundamentals also connect directly to how resources are organized and discovered, which matters for both daily security hygiene and incident response. When resources are scattered across poorly understood subscriptions or projects, teams struggle to know what exists, who owns it, and whether it is still needed. That confusion creates openings for attackers because forgotten resources are often unpatched, unmonitored, or misconfigured. Clear account structure supports clearer ownership and clearer ownership supports better maintenance and faster response. If an alert appears and nobody can quickly identify which environment it came from, containment slows down and impact grows. Beginners sometimes think organization is a nice-to-have, but in security, organization is how you avoid blind spots. When you know where things belong, you can see when something does not belong, and that is a powerful detection advantage in cloud environments. Account boundaries also influence how you set and interpret limits, because cloud providers often enforce quotas within subscriptions or projects. Quotas are often treated as capacity planning details, but they can also serve as security signals. If a subscription suddenly starts creating large numbers of resources, that may indicate a compromised identity spinning up unauthorized compute. If costs suddenly surge in a normally stable project, that may indicate abuse such as unwanted workload deployment. This is a place where billing and security meet in a very practical way, because unusual spending can be a clue that something is wrong. Beginners sometimes ignore billing signals because they feel unrelated to security, but in cloud environments, cost and activity are tightly coupled. Understanding the account model helps you trace those signals to the correct container and then to the identities and resources inside it. Governance becomes much more effective when you apply it at the right layer, and the account model gives you the layers you need for consistent control. Many organizations implement policies that prevent known dangerous configurations, such as overly permissive public exposure or missing encryption requirements. These controls are strongest when they are applied broadly enough to cover all relevant subscriptions or projects, but not so broadly that they break legitimate variation between environments. The tricky part is that policy placement must match how the organization actually uses the cloud, which is why account fundamentals come first. If you misunderstand the scope of a tenant-level policy, you might accidentally enforce something everywhere and cause operational outages, or you might enforce it nowhere important and create false confidence. Beginners often think governance is a document, but governance in cloud environments becomes real when it is encoded into guardrails at the correct scope. That connection between structure and enforcement is a central idea for cloud defenders. When you put all of this together, you begin to see that account fundamentals are not a preliminary chapter you rush through, because they shape every security decision that follows. Tenants define the top-level trust domain and identity authority. Subscriptions or projects define resource scope and practical separation. And billing boundaries influence accountability and visibility in ways that matter for defense. Identity and policy decisions can either respect those boundaries or pierce them, which is why discipline at the tenant layer is so critical. Clear structure supports clear ownership. Clear ownership supports consistent control, and consistent control reduces both accidental exposure and attacker opportunity. For the exam, this clarity helps you reason through scenario questions that ask where control should be applied or how to reduce blast radius without breaking operations. In real environments, it helps you build cloud spaces that are easier to govern, easier to monitor, and harder to compromise in a way that spreads. The account model is the skeleton of cloud security, and once you understand the skeleton, everything else has a stronger place to attach.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.